The mysterious city of Machu Picchu is no longer occupied. It's been empty for nearly half a millennium.
You began to see within this the outline of a doorway.
And we're talking about ultimately being able to recover the power that Pachacutec possessed.
Every year, millions of people climb a narrow mountain trail in the Peruvian Andes to stand at the same viewpoint and take the same photograph. Gray stone terraces cascading down a green ridge wrapped in cloud, framed by the jagged silhouette of Huayna Picchu. It's one of the most recognized images on Earth. And almost everyone who takes that photo believes they are looking at the whole story. They are not. What sits inside that frame is only a fraction of what is actually there. And in the last 3 years, a series of unconnected scientific projects has quietly pulled back the curtain on a version of Machu Picchu that does not match the postcard at all. This isn't a story about ancient aliens or lost civilizations. It's stranger than that because it's real. It involves geneticists sequencing 5-century-old bone samples, engineers flying laser scanners over jungle canopy, and geologists running earthquake simulations on a laptop. Each of these teams was working independently on completely different questions, and none of them set out to overturn what we thought we knew about Machu Picchu. But that is exactly what happened. And almost as soon as the findings started stacking up, a very different kind of decision got made in Lima, one that has very little to do with archaeology and a great deal to do with money. Let's start with the bones, because that's where the story stopped making sense first. For most of the last century, the working theory of Machu Picchu was simple and tidy. It was a royal country estate, built around 1450 by the Inca ruler Pachacuti as a private retreat, a place for the elite to escape the capital at Cusco. It's a clean story. It fits neatly into a museum placard, and it turns out to be far too small for what the evidence shows. A team of researchers working with genetic material recovered from burial sites within the citadel set out to confirm exactly that theory. A genetic snapshot of the people who lived and died there. Instead, the DNA told a completely different story. The individuals buried at Machu Picchu were not a single, uniform population from the Cusco highlands. They came from all over the empire, coastal lineages, northern lineages, and most strikingly, several individuals, women in particular, carried genetic signatures tracing back to Amazonian lowland populations hundreds of miles away across some of the most punishing terrain in South America. Think about what that actually means logistically. To get from the Amazon basin to Machu Picchu on foot in the 15th century, you would descend through humid rainforest, climb through cloud forest, cross exposed mountain passes where the air is thin enough to make your lungs ache, and do it all without modern equipment, without maps, without knowing what waited for you at the other end. People do not casually wander that route. Someone organized it. Someone with the reach and authority to move individuals across an empire like pieces on a board, for a purpose important enough to justify the risk. One detail stood out above the rest. Among the burials, researchers identified what appeared to be a mother and daughter, buried close to one another. But isotope analysis of their bones showed they had spent significant portions of their lives in different regions, eating different foods, drinking from different water sources. 2 lives that unfolded apart in different corners of the empire, before ending together at over 2,400 meters above sea level in a citadel that was never supposed to be a place of mixed origins. That is not what a retreat for one dynasty looks like. That is what the deliberate construction of something bigger looks like, a hub, a center of imperial administration and ceremony, built specifically to draw people, resources, and status from across the Inca world into a single mountaintop. While the genetic story was unfolding, a separate group of researchers was pointing lasers at the mountain itself. LiDAR, a scanning technique that fires millions of pulses of light at the ground and measures what bounces back, has a peculiar superpower. It can see through vegetation, point it at a hillside choked with jungle canopy, and the resulting 3-dimensional map strips away the leaves and branches to reveal the bare earth and stone underneath, the way an X-ray reveals a skeleton under skin. When a team flew LiDAR-equipped drones over sections of the surrounding slopes, areas well outside the fenced tourist path, zones that had been quietly off-limits for years, the scans returned something nobody expected. More than a dozen previously undocumented structures emerged from the data. Platforms, walls, foundations, the outlines of buildings that had never appeared on any survey or map in 500 years of study. Some looked ceremonial. Some looked residential. What mattered more than their individual function was the simple fact that they existed at all, sitting in restricted territory that had never been properly surveyed, hidden not by secrecy, but by neglect and jungle growth. If more than a dozen structures were sitting just beyond the known boundary of the site, the obvious question follows. How much more is still out there, buried under decades of forest, that nobody has ever scanned? Then came the geology, and this is the part that is genuinely difficult to explain away as coincidence. A researcher analyzing satellite and seismic data noticed that two major geological fault lines intersect almost precisely beneath the citadel's central temple complex. On its face, that should be terrifying news. Fault lines mean earthquakes, and earthquakes mean collapse. Cusco itself, less than 50 miles away, has been leveled by seismic activity multiple times throughout its history, with entire colonial-era districts reduced to rubble. But when the team modeled thousands of earthquake scenarios at that exact intersection point, the results were the opposite of what they expected. The two fault lines appear to work against each other, their opposing tectonic forces effectively canceling out, producing a pocket of unusual geological stability, precisely where the Inca chose to build their most important structures. In other words, the single most seismically resistant spot in the entire region is also the exact spot the temple complex occupies. Nobody has been able to prove that the Inca understood the subsurface geology in any way we'd recognize as scientific. But they built there anyway, and 5 centuries of earthquakes that flattened surrounding towns have left this site essentially untouched. That kind of siting decision doesn't happen by accident once. It becomes much harder to dismiss when you learn how much of the site was engineered to survive exactly that kind of stress. Engineers who have surveyed the citadel substructure estimate that what tourists actually see and photograph, the terraces, the temple walls, the plazas, represents less than half of the total construction. The rest is underground. Drainage channels carved directly into bedrock, layered gravel filtration systems, retaining walls, foundation networks built to manage water flow and prevent the mountain itself from sliding or eroding. Rainwater entering at the highest terrace is channeled, filtered, and redistributed through this hidden network before being expelled at the base of the mountain in controlled streams. A system that, after 500 years of monsoon seasons and total neglect following the fall of the empire, still functions today without a single modern repair. And then there's the stone at the summit, carved from a single block of granite, the Intihuatana, often translated as the place where the sun is tied, was long treated as a purely ceremonial object, interesting but not especially significant. When researchers finally measured its orientation with modern GPS equipment, they found it aligned within a few degrees of true geographic north, not magnetic north, which drifts over time, but the planet's actual rotational axis. The stone functions as a solar marker, tracking solstices and equinoxes with a level of precision that has held steady, without adjustment, for 5 centuries. It was carved by hand, without telescopes, without the mathematics we associate with that kind of astronomical accuracy, by people working at altitude with stone tools. Put all of these findings side by side, and a very different picture of Machu Picchu starts to emerge, not a quiet retreat for a single emperor, but a deliberately engineered, multi-ethnic center of imperial power, built on a geologically stabilized point that took modern satellites to identify, more than half of it still hidden underground, ringed by unexcavated structures in zones nobody has properly studied. Every single discovery on that list points toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. We have barely begun to understand what this place actually was, and how much of it is still buried, which makes the next part of the timeline genuinely strange. In January of this year, Peru's Ministry of Culture formally approved a 20-year master conservation plan for the site, visitor limits, preservation guidelines, structural protections, extending out to 2046. It was, on paper, precisely what the research community had been asking for. 3 weeks later, the government approved fast-track construction of a new international airport roughly an hour from the site, a project that had sat dormant for over a decade after being tangled up in a massive regional corruption scandal. Suddenly, it was back, with a target of full operation within 18 months and a projected capacity of roughly 8 million visitors a year, several times current tourist volumes, funneled through a valley whose water, waste, and road infrastructure is already stretched thin. Part of the new runway is being built directly across centuries-old agricultural terraces that are still functioning today, still irrigating, still draining, using the same engineering tradition responsible for the hidden systems beneath the citadel itself. Here's the detail that's hardest to ignore. The official environmental and capacity study, the report meant to determine whether the region can actually absorb that volume of tourism sustainably, isn't due until several months after the airport was already approved. The decision to build came before the data that was supposed to justify it. Researchers, including several of the scientists behind these very discoveries, have publicly warned that the vibration, foot traffic, and construction associated with tourism at that scale pose direct risks to underground infrastructure that has survived half a millennium. The response from officials, so far, has been largely silence. None of this proves a hidden agenda. Correlation is not a conspiracy, and there are plenty of mundane, all-too-human explanations for why governments fast-track infrastructure projects: politics, contracts, tourism revenue, jobs. But it is genuinely strange that a scientific record this consistent, DNA evidence rewriting who built the site and why, LiDAR exposing an entire unmapped periphery, geology explaining why it has survived so long, engineering revealing how much of it remains hidden, arrives at almost exactly the same moment as a rushed decision to dramatically increase pressure on the very ground all of that evidence is sitting in. What we know for certain is this: Machu Picchu is not the site we thought it was 20 years ago, and it may not even be the site we think it is today. Less than half of it has ever been seen by the public. An unknown number of structures are still sitting under jungle canopy that has never been properly scanned. And the clock on all of it, construction, capacity, tourism, is now running faster than the research can keep up with. Whatever is still buried up there, we may be finding out on a much shorter timeline than anyone expected. There's also a simpler, less dramatic possibility worth sitting with, because good evidence deserves an honest counterargument. Infrastructure decisions in Peru have followed this exact pattern for decades. Long before any of these discoveries were made, projects stall for years under corruption investigations, then get revived the moment political and financial conditions align, regardless of what archaeologists happen to be publishing at the time. The Chinchero Airport project has its own long, tangled history that predates the DNA study, the LiDAR survey, and the fault line research entirely. It's entirely possible the timing is coincidence. Two unrelated institutions, science and government, simply operating on their own separate clocks that happen to cross paths this year. Readers and viewers should hold both possibilities at once. The research is real and rigorously documented, and the airport approval may be nothing more than ordinary bureaucratic momentum finally clearing a decade-old backlog. What isn't really in dispute is the underlying science itself. The genetic diversity of the burial population, the previously unmapped structures revealed by LiDAR, the seismic modeling around the fault intersection, the scale of the underground drainage network, and the astronomical precision of the Intihuatana are all independently documented findings, produced by separate research teams using separate methods, arriving at the same broad conclusion from different directions. That convergence is what makes this story worth paying attention to, regardless of what happens with the airport. Machu Picchu has been studied, mapped, and photographed more than almost any archaeological site on Earth for over a century, and it still had this much left to reveal. The honest, unglamorous takeaway may be the most unsettling one of all. We have been standing on top of most of the answers this entire time, and simply hadn't built the tools yet to see them. The question now is whether the next round of tools, the next LiDAR survey, the next genetic study, the next excavation into those unmapped restricted zones, gets a chance to run its course before an airport built for 8 million visitors a year changes the ground beneath it for good.